The sky tasted of metal and old oil. Windows had wept into rivers of molten glass that streamed down the faces of skyscrapers, and the air vibrated with a thunder that never learned the meaning of silence. I woke on the roof of High Vesta, with smoke in my throat and the city below braided into a river of fire. The streets I had run as a child, alleys where we learned to steal kisses and secrets, had become maps of heat. Every corner a new hazard I had to learn all over again. I counted the living by sound. It was the only way to keep from counting the dead and losing my reason. Shouts, diesel engines, prayers muttered into cracked masks, the staccato reports of heavy bolters being drained and swept away somewhere down in the lower wards. Sometimes there were dogs barking, sometimes there were children crying. Lights were gone. The great hive glow that usually turned night into sepia had been cut away like a limb. Vox panels on the roof sputtered like dying beetles. The only voice that came clear was the thin, mechanical voice on my shoulder. Calm. Evac or hold. Evac or hold. Evac, it was an order, not guidance. Orders were simpler when you had someone to follow them with. Orders were knives when you had someone to cut loose. My sister was still trapped in the lower warrens. The Vox had carried the panic down to her. I heard her voice across a dozen cracked circuits, desperate and thin. Mira, she had said, voice breaking on a syllable, as if the word itself were brittle. They're tearing the barricades. I can't. Then the line went full of static, and a different voice, Officer Ruff, told me what I already knew. Evac or hold. Evac or hold. I had been taught to obey. The hive raised us on obedience until it felt like oxygen. But obedience and blood do not always breathe the same way. I ran my thumb over the jagged scar on my knuckle, souvenir of a childhood fight that taught me how to throw a stone so it would sing past a widow's waist. And I knew the truth already. What I chose now would rewrite who I was. There was a smell under everything else. It was not quite smoke. It was varnish and blood drying in the same breath, a metallic sweetness that stuck to my teeth. The sky above Vesta was a bruise of orange and purple. Far off, a blast threw down one entire block like a hand slapping clay. A plume of dust rose and hid the stars. Those other stars, the ones that belonged to the void, had long ago been cut away from this place. Up here, the roof heaved underfoot like an animal in fever. I looked at the ladder bolted to the parapet and saw a dozen small human stories that had climbed that same iron rung. Lovers sneaking cigarettes at midnight, courier boys with envelopes that meant a mother's medicine, militia who had once stood watch and now would not stand at all. The Vox in my ear offered one more procedural thing: an evacuation corridor, a timestamp, coordinates that meant nothing if you were too slow to reach them. Hold meant stay and die in discipline. Evac meant die with a future that belonged to someone else. Neither option felt like salvation. I climbed down because movement was easier than stasis. The first rung of the ladder was hot enough to blister the leather of my gloves. Heat rose in waves so thick it blurred the outlines of the other roofs, like paintings left too close to a kiln. Somewhere below, an auto winch moaned, grappling at a cargo lift that hung like a mouth over the sprawl. A convoy of armored trucks snaked along the hive's outer ring, their exhaust like the breath of beasts. Their lights cut thin knives through the ash. As I descended the last 100 feet, a voice called up, ragged and familiar. Dad's voice, not in words, but in the way the shout curved like a hand reaching for the shoulder it had steadied for years. Memories are a cruel companion under fire. I saw him on the stairwell years ago, insisting we take only what we could carry, his jaw clenched as if the world could be held shut by will alone. He had been right about some things, and wrong about others. The ledger of his truths and mistakes hung in me like a pocket of stones. The lower ward smelled different. The smoke was thicker, more chemical, as if the hive's forges had been fed the roofs themselves. Neon signs that used to promise sin and comfort were tongues of flame. People moved like people do when they are deciding whether to survive or to be remembered. A woman pushed a child ahead of her, her face a mask of practical terror. A man in militia gear argued with a priest who insisted they send up a hymn. A servitor, its limbs a patchwork of weld and prayer, lay half-buried beneath a fallen banner, its single ocular micro-lens cracked, and the servo voice repeated one word like a prayer. Duty. I kept listening for other things. The hive hummed with many small mechanical voices, the ratcheting of load-bearing gears, the cough of failing respirators, the low animal staccato of hydraulic claws tearing through reinforced concrete. When I reached the second tier and could see into the warrens themselves, I smelled something else under the choking fumes. Fear made of metal and old love. Warrens were laboratory of the hive's marrow. They were narrow and pocked, and full of the ghosts of the people who had never left them. I knew the sequence of shafts and conduits that led down, the old way the architects had tried to funnel sunlight into the belly, and how the light had been corrupted into utility conduits and the occasional market stall. I could have followed the evacuation corridor. I could have climbed into the waiting truck with the other faces hunched beneath tarpaulin. I should have. Every rational bone in my body agreed. But blood has its own geometry. My sister, before the fire, could thread through crowds like a seamstress moves through cloth. She could charm a guard with a crooked smile and steal a ration with both hands while his eyes watched the other way. She had the sort of face that made men give her the seat on the tram and then forget they had done it. People trusted her in ways that terrified me. They trusted because they wanted to be held in someone's eye, and she held them like a warm coin. The thought of leaving her in the dark warrens while I climbed into bright safety felt like betrayal in a thin, honest language. As I moved down the stairwell, the emergency lighting flickered and died. My boot found a discarded prayer bead, warm from someone's pocket, threaded with soot. The silhouette of a collapsed gantry cut off the usual path. I had to kick aside a smoldering crate to slip through into a side chute. The chute was narrower than the stair, smelling of old urine and new flame. I could hear her then, not her voice yet, but the rhythm of someone running in a space that was trying to collapse on them. A child's voice somewhere to my left let out a single long scream that rose and broke, just like the voice of a rotor blade. The scream was not for death alone. It was a raw call for anyone who could be called. For an instant, every plan ordered by command looked like a neat, sterile thing that did not care for knees that had knelt in the same church pew for 40 years. I hunched lower, pressed against a rusted lattice that groaned under weight. My shoulder hit a primered bulkhead and left a smear of sweat. The warren opened into a small market square, recessed below ground, a place where the walls were tattooed with the names of trades, where the floor had once been polished by 1,000 boots. Now the floor was an orange-black mosaic, and a toppled vendor cart steamed like a small battlefield. Looters either had not yet arrived or had been interrupted by something worse. Men in training gray armor passed like ghosts, their faces masks of someone who had been taught that the hive was a ledger to be balanced. A Vox signal pitched in the distance, evacuate corridors being sealed, the clang of heavy gates dropping into place. I edged forward because I had to see. A child's hand grabbed mine from the dark like a question. I looked down and saw the child's nails dusted with ash, eyes reflecting flame like two small, very old coins. I thought of the times when my sister had smuggled out bread and distributed it like contraband hope, handing over scraps to hands that reached like pleading birds. She lived by small rebellions. They were her currency. She might be alive because of them. She might be dead because of them. Both things hung side by side like two threats. Above the square, the emergency ladder shaft had been tampered with. Someone had cut the ladder rungs where they met the maintenance ring. It was the kind of sabotage that said whoever did it wanted people to fall in the dark. The bruise of old oil in the air tasted even stronger. I looked up toward the roofline and saw a fist of smoke where the evacuation convoy should have been moving. The vox in my ear had gone human then, the voice of a sergeant, not machinery. Terse and raw. Plan me. Lift at 07. After that, hold. Hold. The word turned over in my mouth and came out like a bitter seed. I crouched behind an overturned crate and thought of names. There were always names you carried. Mine were short and sharp. They had survived because they had to. My sister's name came like a memory of home-cooked soup. It warmed me and did not cut through the ash. The clerk from the administration corridor had once told me there is a science to choosing when to stay and when to leave, calculate assets, calculate chances. He said it with a pen behind his ear and never once had been around when I needed him. The corridor that led deeper into the Warrens was half blocked by a collapsed support pillar. Beyond it, smoke moved in a slow, deliberate tide, as if something massive had taken its time to breathe there. Voices echoed from that direction. Not many, just the ragged syllables of people trying to make sense of instructions that had been stripped away from them. In the layer where oxygen thinned, breath sounded like the grinding of gears. I had my hand on the edge of the collapsed pillar when the calm in my ear shivered. There was only one voice now, a single clipped dispatch that came like a blade through the static. Evac or hold. Repeat, evac or hold. It was not a question anymore. It was the choice, offered like a coin with a face on both sides. My fingers tightened until they hurt on the rusted metal. Behind me, the shaft to the roof was a single ladder, and a long way to go. Ahead of me, deeper into the belly where my sister's voice had last been sound and then gone into static, there was nothing at all but noise and the promise of someone waiting, or someone already gone. I could climb back up, join the convoy, and take a place in a future that might become mine. I could move forward into the choke, where the Warrens kept their secrets, and pull her out by the hair if I had to, or lose us both to some collapse no one had foreseen. The choice did not present itself like a single sharp blade. It was a knot with many frayed strands. My chest felt tight enough that each breath was a small rebellion. I pulled my pack tighter and took one last look at the ladder I had come down, at the light that was being swallowed from above, and then I stepped down into the smoke. The stair gave a muffled groan. The world narrowed to the hiss of heat and the thud of my own boots. The voice on the comm faded into something that might have been grief or might have been protocol. Either way, it had nothing to do with the way my knees trembled. I was going after her. My hands found the next rung, then the next, and the future, whatever shape it would take, drew closer, full of ash and the sound of someone still breathing somewhere below. I had shoved the maps into the false bottom of the Prometheum crate before they finished their questions, folding the paper small enough to fit under warped slats that smelled of oil and old smoke. The crate's metal tasted of soot. When I pressed my thumb against it, the smell clung to my fingers the way guilt clings to the throat. Someone outside cursed. A child began to cry somewhere 2 floors down, a small sound that made the room feel like it might snap. I kept my voice steady because the women and men around me were watching me for instructions, and steadiness spreads quicker than hope. They called themselves the city wardens when they first arrived, but their uniforms did not match any wardens I had ever seen. The tabards were pale blue instead of the usual iron gray, the emblems wrong. No imperial aquila, no regimental sign, only an angular star I had seen on little courier badges and stitched once, badly, onto a scavenger's pack. Their leader wore a mask of polished brass that hid half his face and let his eyes do all the work. He spoke like a man used to giving orders, soft where he needed to be sharp. "Maps," he said, and the word filled the air like an accusation. I handed him a folded ration list and my neighbor's prayer roll instead. "We gave them to Sector Command," I said, "because lies are useful tools until they are not." The warden's sergeant, Sergeant Halleck, I learned then, because names are small blades, tapped his gauntlet against the table and smiled without showing teeth. He asked for names, then business, then to see our clear marks. He asked where the refineries were. I offered him a glance and a shrug and shifted my weight so that the crate hid the maps from sight. When he looked closer, when his gaze lingered on the locket at my throat, I let my hand close over it and felt the warm denting of the family image inside. The child who clung to my sleeve, a thin boy named Jory, who smelled of ash and copper, pressed his forehead to my side. I remembered the way my mother's hands had smelled of soot and iron on the last night we ate proper stew, and how she had told me that maps are only useful to those who read the lines. She had said to be careful who reads your lines. Halleck asked who was in charge. Thomas, who had led the Trade Key militia for 3 winters, stepped forward. His voice held like iron under flame. "We decide here," he said. "Not the strangers on the street." They argued quietly. The wardens checked crates and barter lists. They let a few people go because they needed bodies to keep the city moving. They detained a man with a satchel whose hands trembled too much when he lit his cigarette. Rumors do the rest. By dusk it was said that they demanded the maps from every quarter. By midnight the rumor had a date and a price. I watched the wardens leave through the broken shutters, their silhouettes hunched against the ash-red sky. When the door finally shut, the room exhaled. People hugged, whispered certainties to one another like rosaries. We had no sector command now to tell us what to do, no orbital batteries to keep the sky at bay, and no refineries to keep the generators fed. We had only each other and the smell of burning old things. "We can't give them the maps," Lysa said to me when the room had thinned, and only the ones who could not sleep remained. Her voice was small but sharp as flint. She had been a surveyor before the strikes, and her eyes moved over a floor plan in her head as she spoke. "They don't wear the right sigils. They don't answer to the registry." "You saw the brass on their collars," Thomas muttered. "Efficiency." I kept my hand where it had been hiding the locket. "They've already disabled the battery," I said, because refusal needed a reason that made sense out loud. We needed a reason. If those lines are in the wrong hands, the city is a ladder with its own rungs pulled out. Lysa looked at me like someone weighing a coin, bright and worn. "So what do we do?" "We did what people do when the world shifts. That is, we argued about it until the heat in the room matched the heat outside. Thomas wanted to arm every able body and march to the refineries to take them back. Lysa wanted to find the engineers who worked the battery and bring them out. Jory wanted to join because he thought adventure might replace the hunger. I wanted the maps, felt them like a small animal under my palm, alive in the crate and useless if they were turned over. When dawn clawed up and the sky turned from red to the dull bronze of burned copper, we set out. The streets were a tangle of abandoned carts and toppled market stalls. The air tasted of promethium and iron, and the ground leapt beneath our boots with the ghost of distant artillery. People watched us from doorway shadows, faces outlined in ash, eyes like small moons. Some waved us on. Some closed their doors and shuttered their windows as if the very act might keep luck from noticing them. We moved in a cluster, because numbers make a shape the world recognizes. Lysa led with a battered star map she had folded into a cone. Thomas brought a scavenged slug thrower that rattled like a bad prayer. kept close to the crate, because the maps were heavier than they looked, and because touching the crate felt like pressing my palm to a small, hot thing I had to keep alive. At the southern crossing, the wardens had set up a checkpoint, a crude thing with overturned wagons and sandbags, men in pale blue helmets leaning against improvised barricades. They checked eyes as much as papers. The way someone looked at you told them where your loyalties lay. When we came up, they snapped their visors, and a tall woman with a shaved crown and a face like a coin took our names, and then our goods. Halleck stood at the head of the line, his brass mask gleaming in a sun that did not feel like blessing. He looked at me as if remembering something, or pretending to. "You again," he said. His voice slid warm across the air. "You brought maps for the trade?" I kept my voice even. "Only tenements and rations," I said. He thumbed the locket at my throat. "That's a pretty thing," he said. The gauntlet on his hand left soot on the silver. "Who is she?" "Mother," I answered. The word was small and true. The wardens searched us slowly. They found a length of copper wire Thomas had bartered for a lock. They found a tin of preserved corns. They found Joris coin, rusty and dull. They did not find the crate's false bottom, because I had made sure it looked like a repair, all neat nails and soft rust. When Halleck bent to peer, I felt my heart like a fist. He half smiled and waved us on, his eyes on the street as if measuring the dust for future prints. We were 3 blocks away when the first shot split the morning. At first, I thought it was another thunder of distant guns, but then there were more, sharp and screaming, and in the wake the air changed. People began to run, not yet looking for direction but for cover. A roof 2 streets over folded like a book. A trade cart overturned and spilled its grain into the street, tiny white seeds like startled eyes. Halleck's men ran toward the sound. We froze, then followed at a distance because one learns quickly which ways to test a rumor and which to cling to the map under the crate. Tomas went forward and called to the wardens. Halleck held up his hand, and for a moment they looked like parts of the same machine arguing with itself. A woman came out from between burned timbers, her hair scorched and her clothes dark with soot. She pointed at something in the distance, at the refinery spires that still loomed beyond the city like broken teeth. "They've taken the western stacks," she shouted. Her voice was small, but in it was a cold, like a blade's edge. "And the signal flag is down." The words landed like a bell. Jory sobbed, a sudden thin sound. Water ran down someone's face because sometimes the only emotion left is the one that announces itself first. Lysa grabbed at the map cone strapped to her belt, fingers shaking. "If the stacks are gone, we lose the generators," she said. "If the stacks..." Halleck pushed through the crowd to the front and barked orders like a man trying to stitch a torn sail. He gestured to his men and then to us. "We need volunteers to go with us," he said. "Recon. Who knows the alleys?" Thomas turned to me, and under the grit, his jaw was a map of decisions. "They'll take the maps if they can," he said. "If the wardens go to the stacks and they control the whole net, then whoever shut down the batteries can finish the job. We need to stop them." Lysa's hand closed on my arm. "You don't think we should tell Halleck everything?" she asked. Her voice trembled in the way people tremble when they feel the past tugging at their ankles. I looked at the crate, at the underside where the paper hid. The maps were not parchment to be worshipped. They were strokes and crossings, routes and secret ways, the city's vein chart. In the wrong hands, they were a roadmap to annihilation or salvation. I thought of my mother's hands and the way she taught me to fold corners so that a page could be put into your palm and hidden when strangers came. "No," I said, and it felt like a small explosion in my ribs. "Not everything." Halleck's eyes sharpened like a blade seeking a seam. "Why keep secrets?" he asked. "What do you hide from your protectors?" "Not secrets," I said, meaning it. "Options." I wanted him to look away. I wanted him to order the men to the stacks and then to leave and to let us keep our little animals of paper safe. Instead, he nodded once, a movement like a closing door. "We have men heading west anyway. You want to come, join the line. But if you carry anything that can be used to reorient the city, hand it over." Tomas set his jaw. He had a look I had seen on old veterans, when a man's faith in a uniform is not in the cloth, but in the people who wear it. "We keep showing the city to itself," he said. "We do not give maps to strangers masked in brass." Halleck's mask made a sound like a snort. "Then don't slow us down," he said. "You can fight in the alleys. We'll hold the stacks." He raised his hand and his men followed, moving like a tide out into the street. Lysa turned to me, and the map cone she had kept slapped against her thigh. "We can't follow them," she whispered. "Not in numbers. They'll spot us. Then we won't follow them openly," I said. The maps in the crate were heavy with the city's history and potential. I had watched men walk away in uniforms before, watched the city forget them until their names were only whispered. I had seen what happens when knowledge and teeth meet. One devours, the other protects, and the balance shifts. "We'll go another way," I said. The words were a promise and a plan both. "We go through the old aqueducts. Lisa knows them. They run under the southern quarter and come out by the spare rails near the stacks. We can get within sight without being seen." Joris' eyes grew wide at the thought of tunnels. He had never been underground without fear. "Will there be rats?" he asked. Thomas allowed himself a short laugh, then cocked his head. "We can use a few brave small things. But we will need more than courage. We will need maps." I felt the weight under the crate like a pulse. If the maps were what could lay open the city's bones, then what I would do next would be the first act anyone remembered from this night. The choice to keep them hidden and to take the route that no one else trusted. It was not bravado. It was the smallest kind of rebellion, the kind that starts in the palm and moves out. "Get what you need," I told them. "Light, rope, anything that can help us pass under sight. We'll move at dusk." Lysa nodded, working fingers over the map in her pocket as if memorizing its creases. Thomas looked to the wardens, then back at the crates as if weighing cargo against cause. Jory tucked his coin into his fist like a talisman, eyes bright. We left the crate where it had been, in the back of the room, its false bottom waiting. I put my hand on it once, feeling the small secret weight beneath, and then I pulled my fingers away as if afraid the maps might see me looking. There was no time for second thoughts. The city burned and breathed around us. Somewhere the refineries stacked their black teeth, somewhere the orbital battery lay dark and mute. We were a small knot of people making a larger motion, a choice to slip beneath the city rather than meet the wardens in the teeth of their brass masks. I had hidden the maps. I had drawn a line. We would go under. The first thing I noticed after the firing was how quickly sound grew small again, as if someone had put a hand over the world's mouth. For a long 6-second, the ruined block held only two noises: the slow hiss of cooling last fire and the distant mechanical cough of a transport truck that had not yet figured out whether to run or rot. Then voices rose, ragged, shocked, and the malicious drill returned like a memory trying to crawl back into a broken skull. Orders began to clamp down on us, clumsy and necessary, and my hands learned the difference between trembling and useful work. Someone, Sergeant Cade, I think, moved among the men with a hard economy of motion. He checked faces as if the wounds were accounts to be balanced. Who's still standing? Who's about to fall? Who can carry another rifle? He did not ask whether what we'd done was right. He could not afford soft questions. He barked for water and morphine, for bandages folded like vows. When he reached me, his voice was quieter. "Keep your head," he said, and there was no comfort in it. His jaw worked like a trap. We turned a half-collapsed shop into a last stand, the way people turn a spoon into a prayer. Countertops became firing ports. A display of ceramic vases became scatter for shrapnel and sandbags. I learned how to wedge a lasgun into a broken shelf so it would take weight, not so much to aim as to hold steady for the moment my body could no longer pretend it had no recoil. The lasgun's hum was thinner in a ruined shop, the light from its beam smeared across cracked tiles, and the faded advertisement for a tea that no one would ever taste again. Every hour was a theft, an extortion of memory. I found myself naming things I could not take with me. My sister's hand-stitched curtain, the biscuit recipe Mum kept in a soot-stained book, like offering them as currency to some indifferent fate. We had no medics, not really. We had people who had seen too much and patched it with prayer and duct tape. I learned to pack wounds with only the mechanics of touch and the gentleness of someone who was trying to mend something that might not want mending. I tied a strip of cloth around a shin and tried to make my knots honest in the face of the man's breathing. He grimaced but did not swear. He was younger than I imagined he would be when everything else about him said old. A child had been used as a shield, and all the youth in that man's face had been polished down by the need to survive. Outside, the attackers shifted tactics. They retreated in small, crooked lines, pulling back under the ragged shelter of nightfall and the smog that climbed through shattered roofs like a false curtain. They left behind them a smell that filled the throat, the sour tang of fear, and the coppery sourness that comes after bodies have been moved. I will not say where the child lay. The silence that followed her was thick enough to bruise memory. Men who had not cried in months did then, quietly, in corners where the others could not see. Faces that had been hard suddenly had cracks in them. I had put the bullet of the lasgun through someone being held like a shield. I knew what the rulebook said about such tactics and about the calculus of survival, but rules were not what sat heavy across my ribs. Something else had taken root there. The militia had burned the bridge behind us, not as a gesture, but as a strategy. It had been the only rational act left that day. Deny the enemy a path, force them to commit, buy time for others to leave. We all knew the cost. We all felt the burn of it in the soles of our boots and in the faces of those who had watched their families go in the glow of that fire. There was no going back. Someone who had been laughing over a stolen orange 3 days ago now looked at the smoldering timbers and whispered, "We burned our way into this." There was accusation in the words and grief, but also something like a brittle acceptance. We fortified the shop as best we could. Boards and concrete and the heavy carcass of a city sign made a rampart. A broken gramophone, its needle still pinned in a half-remembered tune, became a table for the wounded. We took turns at the firing ports and at the small stolen comforts, coffee without sugar, an old blanket with a hole the size of an apology. The survivor's breath came shallow and mechanical. We rationed good humor like food. We rationed stories. Memory became a currency we spent carefully. At night, the block was a different creature. Fires painted the sky a bruised purple and made the ruined cathedral beyond our street look like some cathedral of bone. Shadows moved slower then, but they were more precise. Faces in the dark appeared and disappeared like mistakes. I caught myself listening for the child's laugh that would never come. My tongue kept shaping the syllables of recipes I would not bake. Names came and went like gear teeth. Sometimes in the thin hours, I could feel the outline of a life I had been living before. It was like a map drawn by someone else, familiar by shape, but wrong in the small, crucial details. We bartered for ammunition with jewelry and old coins. A woman with hands full of knuckled rings gave me 3 boxes of slugs for a carved wooden doll. She did not ask me what it'd done. I did not volunteer it. When you are hungry enough, barter is an intimacy of desperation. The lace gun chewed through its cartridges and asked for more in the only language it knew. We gave it what it wanted. Arguments broke out now, not about strategy, but about the soul of what we were becoming. "We are defenders," a young man said, voice raw. "We are not killers." A veteran opposite him spat and said, "We are alive. That is enough." I watched faces harden on both sides and realized how fragile distinctions become when the world narrows to the size of your breath. Mercy and necessity are two weights on a scale. When one is removed, the other becomes a cruel lever. I had a part in that balance, and the knowledge sat in my gut like a small hot stone. Raiders probed our barricade at first with stones and shouting, then with fire. They were clever enough to avoid direct assault. They tried attrition. They set a heap of refuse alight across the street to choke us. The smoke pressed into the shop and made it hard to see. Mucus tasted like metal. Men coughed and spat until their throats were raw. A boy I patched earlier coughed and held his chest, eyes wide. He looked at me as if expectation and accusation were the same thing. I wanted to tell him that I had been young once, and stupid, and that those things did not excuse what I've done, but explained it. I had no words, only a compact of muscles and the ability to do small, steady tasks. We began to hoard quiet in corners. A nurse, an older woman called Marta, found an old hymn book and touched its cover like an apology. She sang low at times when the heat made speech thick. Her voice was small and surprising in the smoke. It reminded me of baking bread in a house that did not exist anymore, of hands moving sure over dough. When she stopped, the silence pressed back in. The young man who had argued for mercy did not last long. He stood too close to the window during a sweep and fell with a soft sound. No screams, just the sudden cessation of breath. We wrapped him in a hospital sheet with hands that trembled, then buried him beneath a broken awning. I tied knots that meant something because I wanted the world to know we had been careful in death. The others did the same for the small things we could still order, and then we resumed the schedule of survival. What stayed with me, though, was not the tactical minutiae. It was the taste of smoke and metal, a smell that never quite left me. At night, I could no longer distinguish it from the scent of the day the child shield had been used. They braided together until I could not tell which was which, until my stomach remembered only one thing, the scent that marked what I had done to survive. It was a private grammar of guilt that no sermon could parse. When the attackers tried to use the tactic again, pressing small groups forward with civilians wedged like living ballast, I understood what we had become. We shot because we had to. We retold it as law. We said the words, "child shield," because the phrase made the action seem less like murder and more like mathematics. The men who did not directly bear the firings, owned parts of it now. They shifted uneasily in the smoke and watched their hands as if the palms might confess. There was a moment when I considered stepping away, when the memory of recipes and birthdays and rain-soaked mornings called like a faint, honest bell. Walk away, I told myself. Turn your back and go to a place that still has shutters and working taps. I could have taken a chance in the night, joined the stream of refugees who moved like dark water beyond the burned bridge. But the thought of leaving while the men and women who had been with me fought and died felt like theft. It felt like cowardice made plausible, so I stayed. Staying is an act with its own violence. It is the slow, steady hammering of obligation until something inside you gives. We scavenged again at dawn. I climbed through a gap in a neighbor's roof to sight lines no one else had thought to guard. From there, the city looked like an exploded map, streets drawn in charcoal and fire. I could see movement far off, figures crossing rubble, lit by the occasional flare of a searchlight. Someone waved a rag from a rooftop like a white question. I could keep my head down and count rounds, or I could do the thing I feared more than messy hands and broken sleep. I could make a choice that would change the shape of what came next. I sat on the rotten tiles and felt the warmth of the city beneath me. The smell of smoke was a companion stitched to my clothes. I thought of the child like a bell I could not stop hearing, and then I thought of the bridge and the people who had nowhere left to run. I packed a small bag, water, 2 strips of cloth, a handful of cartridges, and moved toward the doorway of the roof as a plan began to form. It was not a good plan. It may not work. It may make things worse. But it was forward motion, and forward motion was the only thing that had not yet killed me. I slid down the gutter into the shadow of the street, and the ragged light revealed a face I almost didn't recognize. Sergeant Cade, hands empty, looking at me like a man who had decided on something hard. He nodded once. "We hold the line," he said, and there was relief in it now, not condemnation. "But we need eyes that move." His mouth was a thin, dangerous thing. "Go find the flanking path. If you can get to the eastern seam and raise a flare, we might make them show themselves. If you can't, bring back what you can. Do not die stupidly." I weighed his words against the smell behind my teeth. Then I slipped out into the ruin and toward the narrow alleys where the city's heart still beat stubbornly. The smoke followed, an accusing phantom. I told myself I was going to see it through, but I did not know whether see it through meant saving anyone or simply making the end take a shape I could understand. Either way, I moved toward it. We had sweat still in the hollows of our necks when the messenger came. The air smelled of burnt oil and old iron, a copper taste settling on my tongue from the morning smoke. Men and women leaned on wrecked rifles in the refinery yard, breathing ragged and lit by the red smear of a sky that refused to be anything but angry. No one moved at first. The messenger's boots made a hollow sound on the catwalk, as if the world itself were hollowing out around him. He didn't need to speak. He held a single sheet of paper between gloved fingers, edges curled from too many hands. The governor's seal, metal and heavy, hung from a cord at his throat like a sin he couldn't set down. When he offered it, his eyes flicked away, and I saw the equation there. Duty multiplied by cowardice equals salvation for those who could buy it. They had sent a transit manifest, a formal evacuation, stamped with the imperial sigil and a schedule for the last shuttles out. Only those with official papers, the paper said. Only those registered as citizens, registered as contributors, registered as valuable. My mother's name wasn't on that list. My sister's number had been wrong. The scrap of our life, the ration tokens, the birthmark of the local guild, meant nothing beside ink and an embossed seal. Someone laughed then, a thin, broken sound like metal tearing. It was supposed to be a victory laugh. We had pushed their lines back. We had taken the control deck, seized the comms array, and we had held our dead in the same breath as we saved a refinery. The men who'd once cowered behind shutters now stood letting sun and flame wash them, believing that the worst had passed. That laugh broke like a pain. The messenger's paper smelled faintly of lavender and oil, an absurd softness for such a thing. I read the words again. Evacuation authorized seats allocated by documented status. There was a margin note in a hand that wanted to be kinder than its owner. Priority transfers for contributors and magistrates. Evacuation fees apply. The red wax of the governor's seal glinted like a single unblinking eye. It was a vulgar little thing, stamped in the governor's emblem, a stylized tower flanked by coins. Why was this hidden? I asked, not looking at him. My voice felt wrong in my own mouth, sounded like a child's demand. The wind answered with a dry rattle through an abandoned oil pipe. He shrugged so subtly I almost missed it. Orders go up, orders come down. Some commands don't make it to lower warrens, he said. His words were careful, like a man stepping around knives. Only certain departments saw this. He touched the seal with a finger. His hands were steady. He was not the man who had marched in screaming about the governors. Treachery, he was a courier, trained to be a hinge between things. The truth isn't dramatic until you do something with it. For a second, I stood framed against the refinery stack like a silhouette in a broken portrait. The smell of the thermal cleft fuel pumps hit me, sweet, acrid, and the taste of oil was thick at the back of my throat. I reached up before I thought about it and took the seal from around his neck. It was heavier than I expected. Cold, then warm with the memory of 1,000 authorizing touches. I held it up and watched the sun find the metallic crest. In that reflection, I saw the faces of the people who had come to us in the night, the ones we had told to shelter in the lower warrens because the city would hold. I saw the councilmen who'd spoken from balconies and the merchants who had given their guards wages to stand between them and the mob. I saw the governor, his hair a perfect shade of white, his smile calibrated to a distance. "What are you doing?" someone asked behind me. The voice was my brother's. He always sounded younger when he was afraid. I walked without answering. The refinery's throat was open and alive. Flames licked the flare stacks, and a slow metallic song came from the cooling towers. There was a hatch, scorched and ancient, that led to the fuel line maintenance well. The refinery was a beast that ate and breathed oil. Its throat was a cathedral of pipes and valves, hoses like arteries. We had taken it to deny the enemy a fuel source. We had done it to survive. I had intended only to stop one man. The seal smelled of wax and old ink. I remember thinking how absurd it was, that a disc of crafted metal could decide who lived and who stayed to die. I found a brazier, an old can sunk into concrete, where we burned ruined cloth to keep watchmen awake. I held the governor's seal over the flame. The metal began to heat, dulling, then catching a shadow of orange. The wax on its crest softened and ran like a child's lie. The edge of the seal glowed, and I could feel that glow against the pad of my thumb. I did not drop it. I set it into the coals. The brazier took it like a thing it had been waiting for. For a breath, the metal seemed to scream, a high, clear note that pushed at the cage of my ribs. Sparks leapt, and the brazier's flame climbed taller, drawn to the new burning shape. The seal pooled into a small, molten tongue of metal. It sputtered and flung a droplet of orange that hit the concrete and flared. That drop flashed as it hit the stone. Then the refinery's telemetry picked it up. We had cut the main channels, severed the line of sight everywhere but the stack. The flare tower was old enough to have an analog beacon tied into the orbital readers. When the seal melted, the blaze it made was wrong. Too white, too small, too pulse-like to be a simple bonfire. It flashed with a pattern that the orbitals read as authorization, a handoff, a clearance. Someone across the yard shouted that the comms were screaming. That's not a technical term, but it was the only one that fit the way the tower's telemetry reacted, a paroxysm of automated recognition, the refinery signal aligning like a finger pointing upward. I realized, with the slow, sick astonishment of a man waking from a dream and finding himself still in bed, what the brazier had become. The seal had been a key, my fire had been a lock. In melting it, I hadn't simply destroyed an emblem. It made a code the orbital arrays could not ignore. The signal scrawled across the sky with the unambiguous handwriting of DefenseNet hardware. Target verified clearance, requested hostile concentrations confirmed. Above us, the heavens changed. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a pressure shift, like the world inhaling a deeper breath. The sky brightened, a cold and clinical light washing our faces. Then a note, thin and terrible, like a wire strummed at impossible tension. It bore down with the weight of a dying bell. The orbital guns we had feared as legends folded their mouths toward the planet. I could have pretended ignorance. I could have argued that I had only meant to stop one man riding away on the last shuttle, that he should not leave his people to rot. I could have told myself that the orbital arrays were merciful, surgical in their aim. The paper, though, still lay stuffed into my palm, the list of names, the margins of fees, the governor's ledger of human worth. No, my brother breathed. He was standing beside me now, pale and small against the continued light from the refinery. You burned it to stop him. I burned it to stop the transit, I said. My voice quivered and then steadied like a blade finding a whetstone. I couldn't let him. But it will fire on the Warrens, he said. The single fact landed between us, heavy. The lower Warrens, 3 levels, stacked with people who had nowhere else to go. Women with children pressed tight to their chests, old men who still mended shoes for a living, the blind boy who'd been following my sister because she once gave him bread. We had told them to shelter. We had sent them down to hide because the council had promised safe corridors. I felt the flame of the brazier eat at my arm hair. The heat was intimate, obscene. Around us, men were moving, some to the comms to scream, some to the ramps, some to pray. One of the medics dropped to her knees and pressed the palm of her hand to the concrete as if she could hold the world in place. Then the orbital system spoke in a language we could no longer pretend was metaphor. A hiss, a prelude to things that fell from the sky. Bright darts, not yet much more than glinting specks, threaded through the thin clouds. The guns were making a correction pattern, a sighting arc. The refinery beacon blinked like a bone in a dog's mouth, announcing a kill. I thought of the governor's hands, all those clean gestures of oh-so-carefully arranged authority. He would not die here. His transit seal might have burned, but his people would have other seals. The rich had always had redundancy. The poor had only faith, and we were rapidly losing that. Someone grabbed my arm. It was the messenger, his face suddenly not smooth with professional neutrality, but raw, honest. "You know what you'll call," he said. "No accusation, only consternation." "I know," I said. The words fell out like payment. I knew. There was a terrible clarity then. This wasn't a secret anymore. Not just a policy of exclusion, but a deliberate mechanism. Keep the poor penned, allow escape for those who can buy tickets if the city blinks. Let the orbital arrays finish the cleaning where grounders will not. The governor's list had been a sieve, letting some through while holding others back to be buried. I had known this in a way that made my fingers ache with the memory of passbooks and closed doors. But knowing and doing are different kinds of sin. We had won a battle. We had wrested the refinery from the enemy's claws. The victory tasted of iron and ash and the tang of betrayal. It was not the sweet kind of victory songs were made of. It was bitter and hot and immediate. And now the price was moving through the atmosphere toward the lower Warrens, all that dense habitation lined like grain beneath a scythe. I stepped back from the brazier. The molten metal had cooled into a hissed, blackened nub. The wax had burned away into nothing. The seal had been consumed in its original intent. Authorization melted into a smear. It should have felt like triumph. It didn't. It felt like a confession. "You could undo it," someone said. They sounded small enough to be swallowed. The control deck still has override protocol. The control deck. The word hung there, an impossibly bright target in a room already full of targets. We had taken the control deck, we had chewed through their networks and looted their equipment like scavengers in a cathedral. We could reach their systems. We could perhaps jerry-rig a counter-signal. broadcast a false denial, scramble the orbital lock. We had thought like technicians all night, and for hours had cussed and cursed at wires and firewalls until our knuckles bled. But the orbital systems did not work like our little radios. Their locks took minutes to confirm, minutes that would chew through the warrens like teeth-turning grain. We had maybe, time to jam, to fog the arrays, to replace signatures with static. But to do that would mean leaving the yard, stepping into streets still slick with oil and spent ordnance, going down where the warrens open like underground gashes. My hands smelled of ash and governance. I shoved the charcoal into my pocket, felt the heat of it breathe against my thigh. The decision leapt at me like a living thing. If I stayed, I could try to reroute power, to fry the beacon, to tear out the tower's sensor array. If I left, I could run down into the warrens, pounding on doors, dragging people from beds, trying to be loud enough to wake the sleeping and gentle enough to save the ones already broken. The wind carried the first whistle of a descending round. It was a sound shaped like inevitability. I think I heard a child's laugh somewhere below it, a thin silver thread of a sound that made the world tilt. I pulled my jacket around my shoulders, the fabric rasping. The yard was suddenly a place of urgent motion. My brother caught my sleeve, his fingers white. "If you go down, you won't make it back," he said, and there was more fear than argument in it. He looked at me as if asking permission to be afraid. I remembered my mother and the way she braided hair while humming a song that had no words, only rhythm. I thought of the blind boy who'd followed my sister. I remembered the governor's neat handwriting on the paper, the way numbers could replace names without a voice, tremor. I thought of the brazier in the yard and the molten seal that had become a beacon. "Then I won't come back," I said. The sentence did not feel like surrender. It was a choice, a blade in the dark. I turned toward the stairwell that led down, toward the maintenance corridor that opened into air shafts and service elevators. Each step would take me farther from the refinery's open yard and closer to the warren's cramped arteries. Each step would take me closer to people who had not been afforded the luxury of official papers. Above me, the sky brightened again, and the distant drum of ordnance grew into a cadence. The refinery pulsed, reporting its status like a wounded animal. The governor's list lay in my pocket, a folded traitor. I moved. My boots hit the metal stair with a rhythm that might have been a heartbeat. Behind me, men shouted orders into radios and to one another. The control deck would try to scramble. They would not be the only ones. The city had edges. People were people in them. I was going down, not to stop the guns. There was no way I could stop metal from the sky once the arrays took aim. I was going down for the ones who had been left on paper margins, for the ones whose names had not been worth sealing and selling. My hands were empty now except for the folded list. I tucked it against my ribs like contraband evidence and kept walking toward the warren's mouth, toward the dead light and the living fear, because there is a kind of courage that is only the refusal to be silent in the face of the city eating its own. The stairs curved and the refinery's noise bent away. The first bulkhead hatch opened, and the smell of the lower warrens washed up like old laundry. I tightened my grip on the list and stepped through. The sun rose like an accusation. It painted the ash in a color that was not light so much as a kind of truth. Flat, unforgiving, absolute. I remember the first step out of the shelter because the heat hit my face before my eyes had fully cleared. It was an animal heat, not the steady warmth of noon, but the thing that comes from metal and bone and the ruined guts of a city still smoking. The sky above us had been scrubbed clean where clouds once drifted. Now there was only the trail of the orbital strike, a thin scar that looked almost surgical from our vantage. The buildings that had not fallen into themselves stood like broken teeth, white-hot along their wounds. We left with a handful of people and a pouch of coals. The people were all the colors of whatever had been most useful to them. Ash blonde hair, soot-darkened faces, an arm wrapped in a rag that used to be a banner. Names had little purchase in the first hours. We walked by the roofs of houses that were still trying to decide whether they wanted to exist. Somewhere deeper in the city, something large settled into itself, and the sound of it was a long, dull exhale. Someone placed their palm over their mouth and started to cry, not loudly, but in that flat, steady way that keeps you moving. I couldn't tell if it was for the ones we had left behind or for the ones we had chosen to save. The pouch was warm against my palm. The coals inside had stayed alive for reasons I could not explain. A pocket of shadow where heat curled away from cold air, a miracle of containment. I had held them last as if holding a promise. Later, I learned we had not chosen to save everyone out of malice. Decisions in that hour were arithmetic. One child could be carried, one elder could not. There were hands and there were hands, some were stronger, some refused to go without the weight of another body. I had pressed the pouch to my chest when the list of names finally ended. I had thumbed the leather and felt the tiny, stubborn warmth. We walked until the outline of the city fell away and the landscape became the open plain where the land remembers only the weather. The horizon was a bruise of low cloud. In the distance, other columns of smoke rose like sentinels, other survivors, other small funerals. We skirted them because there was no room in grief for more stories. Our small band moved with the exhausted, slow-step logic of people who had already emptied their stores of outrage. Our conversations were hushed and pragmatic. We traded what we could without words. A woman with a scarred jaw gave up her last ration. A boy, no older than my nephew had been, shared a knitted cap with someone whose hair had been singed straight off. At night, the coals were the most honest light. Fire reveals truth, it was said once by someone who had never had to hide by it. Around that small private flame, we told stories in fragments, each a shard of a longer life. I spoke the least. I had a strange superstition that if I said the names of those it saved too often, I would be forced to reckon with the ones I left. So I left the morning inside my mouth, where it could not make a sound that would outpace the low rustle of my comrades' breaths. Instead, I warmed some broth and handed it over, careful to let the pouch cool before I touched it. The coals were not magic. They were a tool and a talisman. With them, I could kindle a fire for warmth, cook a scant meal, and boil water until it tasted less of ash. More than that, they were a contract. The ember in my fist promised that I would not be the last to remember how to make a home. Home had shifted under our feet. It was no longer a place, but a bundle of acts. Keeping a kettle on, naming someone at the table, sweeping a doorway. Those acts required heat, and heat required either finding wood or carrying an ember. So I carried. There were days when I thought the pouch was a light thing. Then we'd push on, and I would notice that my fingers had a permanent curl to them, as if they had forgotten how to relax. The skin around my thumb became a map of my choices, pale crescents where the pouch strap had rubbed, a thin scar where I had driven my nail too deep, trying to pry something loose in the dark. Each mark was a ledger entry. I learned to read my hands as one reads ledger paper. They told me who I had lifted, who I had left, who I had lied to in order to keep moving. Memory pressed like a foreign object under the skin. On the third week, we crossed a river that had been made strange by the fall. Floating on its surface were fragments of a market, splinters of wood carved, a child's tin whistle, a battered kettle. We rafted those things across like contraband. The kettle clanged when we pushed its dented body into the current, and for a moment, its sound did not belong with anything else around us. I thought then of the promise that had been made between my hands and the coals, that I would not let rituals die. I thought of how, in some future I could not yet see, Someone would lift that kettle to the fire, and the sound would be a promise kept. We found other survivors who were rebuilding their own small sacred things. A woman in a field had planted a line of sticks in the ground in the shape of a fence. A man had set 3 stones carefully on top of each other and called them an altar. There were children who had learned to pick up old glass and turn it into a kind of ornament. They were not ignorant, they were stubborn. They were doing the thing that our world taught us from the first breath: make something from what remains. They burned the dead softly, enough to honor them, but not to feed some wider war. They built altars from the wreckage, because ritual held people together when architecture had failed. When we stopped in a place that had been a village once, we were obliged to decide how much of ourselves to offer. The people there had made a crude counsel. They asked to see my pouch. They wanted to ensure we were not carriers of fire that would consume them. There was suspicion in their eyes, the rightful kind that comes from having survived too many strangers who claimed refuge and took instead. I held the leather out and let them see the glow. The oldest among them snuffed out the flame and cupped the remains in their palm, and I watched their fingers tremble as if the ember had weight beyond its size. They returned the coals to me and said, "You carry us with that." It was not a literal statement. It was their way of telling me that the promise inside that pouch could be turned into a thing that belonged to more than one hand. We started to lay foundations in the smallest possible ways. A corner of a house was reassembled. A well was cleared. We marked graves, not with grandeur, but with the precise sharpness of a name placed where it would be found. We worked with a slow attentiveness, because haste had been the enemy when the sky had opened. When someone told a story, we listened all the way through. Listening is a kind of rebuilding. You stitch a person back by keeping the seam taut. My hands grew into a new vocabulary. Where before I had used them to open cans and strike flint, now I learned to trace levels and measure grain. I learned the balance between caution and necessity, how much mortar could be mixed with water that still had grit in it, what sort of root would bind a thatch to a frame. Once, while mending a child's doll, I pressed my thumb too hard and felt the blister pop. I did not scream. The pain used to be a simple alarm. Now it was a language telling me I was alive enough to feel. I wrapped my hand, cursed softly, and went back to work. Scars multiplied, not the kind that make a story of heroism, but the honest, kitchen table kind that say you stayed and you did the small chores of living. I found that memory chooses the strange moments to resurrect itself. At dusk, I would sometimes see the curve of a street lamp, and my mind would overlay the past on the present. I would smell the bakery that no longer existed, and for a second, the world righted itself. Those moments were both comfort and cruelty. They taught me what it was I was reconstructing, not the exact street or the exact color of paint, but the feeling of being safe enough to store spoons in a drawer again. The promise of home was not about bricks. It was about what we did when we had spoons. Still, choices have weight. I could name them by touch now. The pocket that held a child's boot, the faint indent in my palm from a coin I had given away. There were nights when I sat outside the new shelter and watched the pouch of coals cool in my lap and imagined the faces of those I had saved as props in a theater I had abandoned. Guilt is practical. It requires tending. I tended mine like the coals, kept it wrapped, and found a way to make it useful. Sometimes that meant telling the truth about why we had left others. Sometimes it meant lying for the sake of the living. Both acts burned in the same way. When I finally decided what home had come to mean for me, it was not a revelation so much as a cadence. Home was what I carried. It was the pouch of coals, and the list of names, and the crooked spoon we had saved from a burnt-out tavern. It was the promise that wherever I set down that spoon and said someone's name aloud, the place might find a chance to be inhabited again. The cost of that reconstruction was written on my hands, scars, knuckles that ached in cold weather, a permanent curve to my fingers from gripping the pouch. The price was not only physical. I had traded certainty for a kind of itinerant stewardship. I would always carry obligations. Now I would always need a fire. There came a morning when we had to decide whether to stay and make of the village a place of slow repairs or to set out again toward a rumored safehold far to the north. The safehold was a thing of whispers and maps frayed at the edges. Perhaps a haven, perhaps another ruin. I looked at the people around me. The boy with the knitted cap had a fever. The elder with the ragged banner coughed in the corner and watched us with a patience that felt like accusation. My hands hovered over the pouch. I could start a fire that would heal a fever for one night, but it would not cure what ailed us all. We had to choose not just which faces to save, but what promise to keep. Do we follow the maps that promise shelter, or do we return to the city's edge and try to coax a community into being where ash still smolders? Is home rebuilt by flight or by those who stay to lay down mortar with the dust of what was? The pouch whispered in my palm as if impatient. It wanted to be put to use, to be entrusted to a hearth and forgotten into the rituals of daily life. But promises do not die simply because one person wants to honor them. I stood up then, slow enough that everyone noticed. My voice came out reedy but steady. "We go north," I said. My decision was not a denial of the people who remained. It was a recognition of the limits of my hands and my coals. To make a home, sometimes you must find ground that is not already claimed by ruin. To make a promise that endures, you sometimes have to carry it farther than your feet would like. I felt the pouch warm under my palm as if in answer. We packed what little we had, and we prepared to leave. The boy's fever was wrapped in linen, and Hope the elder's cough was steadied by broth. Someone tied the doll's repaired arm to their belt. There were things I wanted to take back to the city, stones, a splintered sign, but I could not carry everything. The pouch fit in a pocket. It contained a coal and, in its way, a reason. As we turned our backs on the smoke line, the plain opened before us like a page not yet written. I set my jaw against the wind and felt the new weight of the future in my hands. The coals were small, almost laughable against the sweep of sky, but I had seen what a single ember could do in the right fingers. Kindle fire, keep a child from dying, warm a kettle so someone could make a promise aloud and keep it. That was enough to set a direction. We moved toward the north, toward rumor and the chance of shelter. Every step was an offering to the small rituals we intended to preserve. I walked with the pouch against my chest and realized that home had become an act I would practice until I was no longer sure where it began or ended. The road ahead was uncertain and long, but it was a road that required doing, lighting, feeding, naming, again and again. My hands hurt in a way that felt like proof. I clenched the pouch once more and began to walk.